Okay, here's my presentation. Let's start right here. I do not like the word puritanical. I do not like this word. Too many syllables. No, I'm just kidding. Do you guys like the word puritanical? It is an old as fuck word. You guys don't like the word puritanical either. Okay. I don't like the word puritanical because it feels like it is a dogma. It feels like something that we just say to signal to people, you know what I'm talking about. You guys know what we're talking about, right? Puritans. First of all, I don't like this because the Puritans were a real people. I don't like using this as a dogma because it makes us forget sometimes the origin of a word. And sometimes when we look into that origin, it gives us a better understanding of like some things that we're missing. There's a video essay by Atunche Films called In Defense of Puritanism from 4 years ago that sort of talks about the complexities of the Puritan movement, which was essentially this English Christian progressive revolutionary movement that ended up settling in the Americas and proceeded to have a lot of issues in terms of making the ideology work as a way of living for a settlement. But there's this really telling section at the end that kind of speaks to the parts of Puritanism that are actually kind of endemic to the things in society that we consider good. Making fun of liberal democracy is what I do for a living in a lot of ways, but the aspects of liberal democracy that we're supposed to hold dear, a lot of that comes from the Puritan tradition. I'll show this part in particular.
No less a Massachusetts man than John Adams credited progressive Puritanism as the catalyst for liberal democracy. In a 1765 polemic, Adams argued that New Englanders of his time had much to learn about political agitation from their Puritan predecessors.
It may be thought polite and fashionable by many modern fine gentlemen, perhaps, to deride the characters of these persons as enthusiastical, superstitious, and republican, but such ridicule is founded in nothing but foppery and affectation, and is grossly injurious and false. Religious to some degree of enthusiasm, it may be admitted they were, but this can be no particular derogation from their character, because it was at the time almost the universal character, not only of England but of Christendom. Whatever imperfections may be justly ascribed to them, which however are as few as any mortals have discovered, their judgment in framing their policy was founded in wise, humane, and benevolent principles.
I just played that speech very quickly, or that quote very quickly. It essentially goes over how, the founding fathers... asterisk. The founding fathers found a lot of their ideals of secularism and government and equality of man to be derived from the Puritans and aspired to a lot of what the Puritans did, although feeling that there was a lot that they had to get better. And this is why it's so interesting that now the modern usage of the term puritanical, especially in social media discourse, is ascribed to conservatism. It's ascribed to, moral perfection that is, connoted with conservatism and thus connoted with the exact thing that progressives are supposed to be fighting against, right? You're just like those damn Puritans, just trying to stomp out all free speech and make us all follow this Christian creed, right? I just feel like that's a little bit, losing the nuance of who the Puritans were, because there were a lot of disagreements within the Puritans. That's part of why they ended up having, those issues with tyrannical government to begin with. But also, are these qualities not found in like many other places as well? Is it true that the Puritans were unique in this quality? And why is it that the progressive bona fides of the Puritan movement are never mentioned? The fact that they were rebelling against English monarchy and the oppressive hierarchical domination of the papacy, that they were striving for equality, in certain ways. Of course, they had a lot of hypocrisy in that area, but they were certainly, more progressively strident about equal representation in politics. The town hall meeting comes from the Puritans, right? It's something you can learn about in that documentary. It comes from meetings that were designed as direct democracy within New England, those New England settlements. So why the Puritans? And also, is what the Puritans ended up doing, which involved, all types of infighting, all types of like racism against the natives, the indigenous folks in that region, and of course the infamous Salem witch trials, right? These are all manifestations of what happened to the Puritans. But when we look historically at progressive movements, there's always some degree of what people sometimes refer to as purity testing, right? There's always some degree that people have big arguments. There become these strict kind of codes that you have to follow, and if you're not with, you're against. The Haitian Revolution was like this. The French Revolution was very much like this. So why is it that we refer to people as puritanical and not montagnards, right? As in like the mountain part of the French Revolution, with Robespierre and them. They had a very obvious sort of fall into these same dynamics of persecuting people who didn't live up to that moral code, and that creating this mechanism through which anybody could be persecuted with a sufficient accusation and all of that, the reign of terror, all of that, right? But we unilaterally see the French Revolution as this key moment, especially in Western history, but even in world history, that leads to the ending of like repressive monarchies and like opens up all these new avenues of liberal democracy, right? I mean, the Haitian Revolution then doesn't happen because of the French Revolution. And that's not even to speak about the American Revolution and the Puritans before it. So this becomes a term that now we use to describe people online that are really, really sensitive about silly things and then want to control everybody else based off of their hypersensitive values. And in that way, I also just hate the term puritanical because it's very easy to become unempathetic of anybody that strongly declares a held belief in something moral as puritanical. Your average, progressive in America can get called puritanical for any which reason because they think we shouldn't do genocide, And so this term especially gets ascribed to Gen Z. And now we'll talk about that. You can't go on social media without occasionally running into posts like this. Someone please tell me why the younger generations, mine included, have become so puritanical. I would say it's performative, but genuinely these people are either so committed to the bit or they're beyond help. And what's so funny about this, first of all, is who are we referring to, right? It could be about Puritanism and leftist politics, God knows that we hear about that shit all the time. I was looking at an El País article that touches on that. It's a right-wing Spanish paper, but that's a whole other thing. Some people are like, I don't understand how this is a bad thing. And it's like, maybe they're far-right conservatives saying that, but also it's hard to have a response to a kind of vague post like this. Matt Barron says Puritan has become an adjective that means something else, just like we see with other words, pagan, Luddite, etc. Right, which I think is just so funny, because the Luddites were protesting on behalf of labor. That's something that Dr. Fatima mentions in her recent video essay. They're protesting against labor exploitation, right? And pagans were just the, people who believed in different religions before Christians came there. So it's just like, but now it's like these terms get thrown around and instantly we think, okay, well that means that these people are just not to be taken seriously, which is really funny because it kind of reflects on how we don't take these histories particularly seriously ourselves, in my view. To really get at why I think this is such a big problem, calling Gen Z puritanical, I want to start with this Newsweek article. Woman 22 claims Puritan culture is infiltrating Gen Z, sparks debate. Now we're going to get our first crack at somebody saying why Gen Z is puritanical for this video. And this goes in many directions. But essentially, there was a debate on TikTok about how Gen Z views work, wellness, and ambition. A Michigan woman talks about a bizarre shift towards conservative values among young women. So it was basically a TikTok where she's making fun of people who are like, oh, I just want to have a soft life. I want to chill and watch my little shows and drink matcha and go to my silly little Pilates class. I don't dream of labor, etc., right? So this is a very specific little social phenomenon that occurred within the past few years of especially women or feminine coded people being like, I want a soft life. It's really funny because if you dig deep into the Eliot history books, hopefully this TikTok has been deleted, but there was once a TikTok of me saying something to this effect. I don't even remember how it goes, so that just shows you my growth. But I was essentially talking about how I don't want to be here to work hard. I want to be here because to be mildly attractive and have fun or something. I said something like that. So apparently she told Newsweek that she believes the trend reflects a broader retreat from the progressivism that once defined her generation. Gen Z has been massively infiltrated by Puritan culture and hyper-conservative values. Everywhere you look, you see young women in their 20s claiming their days of going out are over, cracking jokes about crocheting, sleepy girl mocktails, and going to bed at 9 p.m. sharp. It's not only alarming, but frankly bizarre behavior for such a young and lively age group. What kind of confuses me about this is that it's like, oh, these are supposed to be hyper-conservative values, but it just sounds like you're talking about people who maybe don't like to party. I think this maybe gets at what we'll later see in this conversation, which is that sometimes we conflate behaviors from Gen Z that are very influenced by not just recent social trends, but current economic situations, and say, well, this must reflect that they have certain political values that I don't like. So that's where I think it's quite funny, and it even gets talked about a little bit in this article. This person argues that prioritizing health and wellness is important, but many people in Gen Z are doing it as a complete escape from having to make any real plans for their lives. And it just kind of feels like that's not substantiated very well. But also somebody else points out that they interviewed a future trend forecaster at Tectonic Shift. I don't know what any of those words mean. It says, basically, we've been living through a broader slowdown movement since the pandemic, paired with what I've been calling the home as the new center. It made slowing down and staying in feel logical, not lazy. And she connects it with, Gen Z kind of realizing that hard work doesn't give you the classic milestones. And so they're opting out of the chase and building a slower, lower cost rhythm that actually supports their mental and physical health. So that's where a lot of the wellness stuff comes from. Now, a lot of you might have clicked this video thinking we were going to talk about Gen Z being puritanical, and your idea of what that means is vastly different. You thought we were going to talk about something completely different, and we probably will talk about it. But I think this just kind of illustrates how sometimes everybody is saying something, but everybody means something very different. And especially in the case of like Gen Z Puritanism, there's this idea that Gen Z is puritanical, but then everybody's saying it to mean something very different. Dark Wolf kind of points out something interesting in the chat. These aren't conservatives, they're just people that don't want to be stressed out and exhausted all the time. So I find it kind of strange to call those Gen Z folks puritanical. But that's far from the only way in which people are calling Gen Z puritanical. So let's start with like the most obvious narrative, I guess, which has been that related trend saying that Gen Z is becoming more conservative. Gen Z is becoming more conservative. How many times have you guys heard this? Like words have meaning, they mean things. So, as Squirrels in My Kool-Aid kind of mentions, we thought this only applied to white cishet Gen Z boys. And indeed, that is what comes up with this, right? So we'll start looking at statistics. This is from a Rutgers piece. I have to tell you guys, when I did the research for this was very exhausting. This was one of the most exhausting research things I've done for any video because there's just so much disparate stuff and a lot of the polling feels way less conclusive than what it's supposed to mean. So for instance, like we're supposed to look at how, hey, Gen Z is more conservative because, Gen Z is voting more Republican. And then it's like, well, obviously that's not true of Gen Z women. These statistics show that, for instance, like Gen Z women's support of the Democratic nominee would have been in 2020 and 2024 election cycles we're looking at. Would have been at a pretty high rate in 2020 and then a lower rate in 2024. And then their support for the Republican nominee, it's supposed to be getting a little bit higher. But then the correlation between the people who are not supporting the Democrats and are supporting the Republicans is actually not very strong. So they write here that according to this Edison exit poll, the only age cohort of women that increased their support for the Democratic ticket and decreased their support for the Republican ticket from 2020 to 2022 was women aged 65 plus. And the only age cohort of women that voted for Trump over Harris was women aged 45 to 64. Now this is one poll. And it sort of shows that, okay, it seems like there's a slight decrease in support for the Democrats, slight increase in support from Republicans among people of this age range. But then there's other polls, like this article from Generation Tech by Jean Twenge. It talks about this trend. There's several recent articles talking about the growing conservatism of Gen Z men. Gen Z men are strikingly more conservative than the millennials before them. Now, the first thing that this blog points out is that, yeah, it's true that more young adults voted for Trump in 2024 than in 2020, but that's not the same as identifying them as conservative. In fact, fewer 18 to 29-year-old Americans identified as conservative in 2024 than in 2012, which was the last year that all 18 to 29-year-olds were millennials. You could cherry pick statistics all day to support the case that Gen Z is more conservative, and you can also do the inverse. If I told you there's fewer 18 to 29-year-olds right now that identify as conservatives than there were when all the 18 to 29-year-olds were millennials, that's easy, boom, checkmate. Millennials were more conservative than Jay-Z. Oh, not Jay-Z. Than Gen Z. I'm sorry, this shit cooked my brain. Nobody's more conservative than Jay-Z. Jay-Z doesn't like graffiti, apparently. That's a whole other conversation. But yeah, I could easily just make that argument. Gen Z is actually more progressive or less conservative than millennials. And then we have these like polls that show that exact dynamic. Look how it was going up between 2012 to 2017. The amount of 18 to 29-year-olds who identify as conservative. And look at how it's apparently fallen off of a cliff going into 2024. This is from Cooperative Election Study. And this blog also points out that it's not really so much about conservatism as it is about wanting radical change. This is where we start to get a little bit warmer. Gen Z is more pessimistic than young adults in past decades, more likely to agree they find it difficult to hold out hope for the world, or that they often wonder if there's any real purpose to life in light of the world situation. Fewer young adults identify with a political party, and they're more ripe for the picking of any candidate or party that promises change. So voting against the incumbents, wanting sweeping change. And look at this other poll. This is the percent of US adults who agree with negative statements about the country by generation. In 2020, Gen Z was the highest. And as it turns out, it's lower for each of the age ranges. Yeah, there's also, a higher apparently percentage of Gen Zers who found the founding fathers to be villains, who say America's not a fair society and say that there's significant changes needed. And this blog also points out that, the Trump election was obviously one election, and there's been different conservative elections around the world, but also there have been elections like that of Zohran Mamdani's in New York City. Mamdani is very popular on the internet among people even across different political ideologies. He recently won the Democratic primary election for mayor and then the mayorship after saying he doesn't like capitalism and favors more government programs to help voters economically, including freezing rents and making bus service free. So for Gen Z voters who think significant changes to government are needed, Mamdani promised a much more radical change than his closest opponent. And so the Mamdani case is like, okay, well, Gen Z actually got way more engaged in politics because they were promised something more progressive than they had ever seen. So again, this idea like, okay, Gen Z is definitely conservative. It's not that there's like zero evidence for it, but it's inconclusive, and it oftentimes ignores a more important reality, which is that as we're seeing systems are collapsing and things are getting worse, Gen Zers are the young adults living in that reality, whose reality is more shaped by that, and they are much more anti-establishment, as Lady Grace says, anti-establishment. Julia's also points out like there can be big differences between younger and older Gen Zs, right? So I'll just briefly show this Crutches and Spice TikTok from right after the presidential election, basically making this case in the heat of these accusations being made, the heat of all these articles that came out. Gen Z is conservative, Gen Z is conservative. Gen Z men making this point.
By the way, the polling on Gen Z is wrong, and I feel like you're going to walk away with the wrong lesson about Gen Z being more conservative. Yes, I encourage all the podcasts from liberal and leftist men. Yes, well, not really liberal, but leftist men. Yes, I encourage people talking to their community members about misogyny and racism. But Gen Z is not more conservative. I don't know what to tell you. First of all, polling is just a select number of people that they actually asked. It is not representative of the entire demographic. It is extrapolating data about a large group by asking a small group. Okay? That's important. I don't think Gen Z is more conservative. I think they're hopeless. I think they spend a majority of their educational career dodging bullets and having shooter drills for a majority of politicians to reduce things down to a debate, right? Then they spend about 6 months to a year. Now, let's be honest. You didn't really have a quarantine, okay? You had like a week and a half of you baking. There was no real quarantine. The people talking about that are wrong. But they had a good amount of time at home due to a pandemic, right? To save the most marginalized. Only to go back to school under a different president and lose a majority of this accessibility that they got while they were learning from home, right? Like a majority of the precautions all of a sudden didn't matter anymore, because it was a different president, and all of a sudden the illness went away because there were vaccines and such. Spoiler alert, it never went away. It's still here, and avian flu is not far behind it.
So I'll pause there, and it goes along with what Holly Ann said a little while ago in the chat. We have no lived memory of a time when the system ever worked. Just as a bit of personal perspective, I am in the middle of Gen Z and millennial. I'm 29. I have identified more with Gen Z a little bit, because I'm on the younger side of 29, but also because I had this distinct feeling growing up that the system, even as it was working as intended, felt disproportionately unfair, felt like it was kind of being held up by paper, and felt like things were getting worse. I had seen the ways in which even Democrats like Barack Obama operated when it came to immigration and when it came to foreign policy. I had seen how many people grow up through the system and end up miserable in their workplace. I had seen how the economy was difficult. I had seen how the rich were bailed out. And I had seen that somebody like me, who was a little neurodivergent, who was a little bit marginalized on behalf of race and, queered as well. I had seen how somebody like me, who was wanting to be creative and cared about social justice issues, felt like a complete kind of outcast among people who were succeeding in this system, among people who were, feeling like the system was what it needed to be. I had felt from a pretty early age like a Gen Zer might feel now. And 2020 in particular was such a watershed moment that we can't really talk about anything with regards to Gen Z without talking about that. And it's a little bit strange sometimes that we focus more on ascribing characteristics to obviously a very ephemeral idea of a generation, of a type of Gen Z person. We focus more on ascribing them characteristics that they have rather than thinking about their reactions to a world that they live in. So it's not Gen Z grew up in a situation where social isolation was more and more the norm. They grew up in a time where COVID and pandemics and then this irreverent attitude that people in power and then eventually society had towards each other's safety derailed their ability to feel comfortable socializing with other people. Or, they grew up in an environment where the economy was worse and worse and they, were trying to go to college in a time period where it was clear that the whole path of going to college, incurring debt and getting a job was essentially no longer viable. Instead of thinking about the conditions through which a bunch of these people, millions and millions of people find their way to react to, we have to think about, they are too lonely. They're too puritanical, they're too judgmental of others. And it's like, maybe some are as a response to those conditions, but aren't the conditions more interesting? Don't they tell us more? Don't the issues tell us more? So I find that this becomes especially palpable when it comes to the gender divide thing. Because this is an interesting article from a magazine called The Argument by somebody named Maybrit Henkel that came out a few days ago. And it sort of tackles the idea that even the men of Gen Z are especially conservative, right? Because if we look at some polling, more polling, okay, from the publication's National Registered Voter Survey data, a lot of this says that people within these age ranges, 18 to 29, are actually the least likely to identify as conservative or really, really conservative again. Young men are the cohort least likely to describe themselves as conservative among men. And, all these different progressive positions that, younger men apparently take. Now, all of this could be countered by a different poll that comes out tomorrow that's actually, young men say something different. But again, the polling is not super compelling. And even in what it tells us, it could be spoken about way more interestingly if we were to just talk about the issues. These are folks who were shaped by an environment where socially progressive ideas were more common, where they saw more representation of different marginalized identities, where they were able to commune with people across the world on the internet, and when they saw, again, all these forms of systemic collapse. But as Afro Nerd Media says, people just want a finger wag, right? This polling offers us this ability to be actually the kids are this and actually the kids are that. So that's sort of me teasing out the main thesis, but it would be impossible for me to really talk about this without talking about what I come across as the most common way people talk about Gen Z being puritanical. Long sentence. When people say Gen Z are puritanical, what do you think that they're referring to? What does it usually come in the context of? And for me, it's this. Gen Z puritans are sex negative. We are inventing so many words. Gen Z is puritanical about sex. Now, I have many different things I'm going to say about this. I could talk about my issues with this statement, but the first one should be going back to what we talked about in the intro, which is we're just using this word puritanical and we're not even thinking about the irony of who the Puritans actually were. So this was in 2013. A PhD doctor named Lisa Wade for a blog called Sociological Images talked about these memes that College Humor made about Puritan-themed Valentine's Day cards, right? Would you be my necessary vessel of procreation and nothing more? I need you to help raise livestock and crops, or surely we will starve to death come winter. Very funny, right? But this person's observations are, and they use these different sources: Sexuality in 19th Century America, Behavior, Ideology, and Politics by Estelle Friedman, Intimate Matters, A History of Sexuality in America, Puritans and Puritanism in Europe and America, a comprehensive encyclopedia, right? So they use a brief survey of some pretty useful historical sources to say that the Puritans were kind of more pragmatic. When the Puritans landed on the rocky east coast of America in the 1600s, they brought with them the belief that sex should be restricted to intercourse and marriage, hence the sentiment on the left. Would you be? Yeah. All non-marital and non-reproductive sexual activities were forbidden, including pre- and extramarital sex, homosexual sex, masturbation, and oral and anal sex. Alongside religion, there were practical reasons why the Puritans were so darn puritanical. Colonizing the US was a dangerous job. Lots of people were dying from exposure, starvation, illness, and war. Babies replenished the labor supply. Again, like, both of these things are very common in a lot of societies. All types of Christians were like this, okay? It wasn't just the Puritans. So this idea, like, it was just, this unique puritanical thing to restrict sex isn't really very compelling. Maybe what people are trying to say is Gen Z has retrograde, conservative ideas about sex. And now we can talk about that, right? We can unpack that. The way that this usually gets talked about is that somebody is reacting to some weird thing that happened on social media where a bunch of apparent young people acted really weird about something sexual. This TikTok says, Gen Z Puritanism off the charts this week because what do you mean people are referring to Doechii flashing a crowd as sexual assault on a mass scale and losing their minds over the AO3 Kinktober list having actual kinks on it? I am so sorry for people who don't know what any of these words mean. We're talking about Gen Z, okay? Some of you in the chat might have just lit up seeing some of these words. So there are usually these moments where a celebrity does something sexual in public, and then you will find that a bunch of people are like, what the hell is wrong with these kids? Sometimes you'll see them before you see the actual kids. What the hell is wrong with these kids? They're acting like anything sexual in public is horrible, and it's apparently, violation of consent. And it's true, you will see that sometimes. You will see sometimes posts by people online, usually in fandoms, that are like, is it just me or is this a violation of my consent? Or, this is gross behavior, or et cetera, right? I'm jealous of the people who don't know, to be honest. Skibbity 67 talk. That is Gen Alpha. Now, I don't know why this idea that seeing certain people's behavior in fandom spaces on social media is an indication of behavior and thinking across an entire group of people. I don't know why that is done, okay? It would be very strange for me to be like, Gen Z hates autotune. Because every time you see a K-pop artist put out a song with a lot of auto-tune on it, all these Gen Z puriteens talk about how it covers up their voice and it doesn't sound good. This is not the kind of observation that would be very strong grounds for sociological analysis. Just to show other examples, being a true freak during the Gen Z Puritan culture era is not for the weak. And people in the comments, genuinely, what happened? What is this purity wave? Why are teens acting like Victorian nuns suddenly? So if we're genuinely curious, right, it might have to do with stuff like this. Sometimes the examples of people having these very adverse reactions, young people, to adults' behavior and their sexual discussions, etc., can be, limited and repressive and not great takes. And sometimes they will be things like this, where a Vanity Fair interview with cast members from SNL includes this anecdote from one cast member named Chloe Fineman.
No, I was fired as a camp counselor.
For hitting on the campers?
What is that? No, I pantsed a boy.
Oh, honey, I think you're on a list somewhere.
And he wasn't wearing underpants.
Oh!
And then a giant school bus drove by, and they were like, "You can't," because he would lift my shirt all the time.
Oh, what is happening?
It was Berkeley.
How old was the child?
He was 6. No, it was a different time.
So that's weird. That's really, really bad. You have a bunch of adults laughing in a room. Well, really one adult. I think everybody else was just kind of sorting out their feelings. But Chloe Fineman basically says that she pantsed a 6-year-old, revealing his private parts to the world because he used to lift up her shirt. It's just a terrible thing. I mean, why would that be in your mind? Why would retaliating against a 6-year-old be a thing that comes to mind in this way? And so sometimes these reactions, come from places where young people are actually really uncomfortable with a lot of things that are apparently normalized in terms of how we discuss sexual stuff. It's not always that it's just something so innocuous. Sometimes, especially in an era where we're talking about the Epstein files, it's kind of normal, especially for people who are younger and developing their worldview, to get really upset about the casualness with which we talk about sometimes non-consensual sexual things or sexual harassment or things that happen sexually, oftentimes that have to do with like really bad things. But I think for a lot of people, it's a lot easier to analyze things like this, to say that, I won't play the full video, but this one content creator says that the random resurgences of Puritanism that we see in Gen Z arise because Puritanism is a great defense mechanism for people who don't have social skills and are uncomfortable with themselves. And this is not a reaction to this, right? It's not a reaction to people reacting to this kind of thing. I'm sure this person would say, wow, that story is really awful. People should be shocked and chagrined by it. But not connecting those dots, I think, is a big mistake. Yeah, sharing that is a really wild story in the first place, right? And then you have these cases that are a little bit grayer like this, that really kind of get at what people, get upset about. This was a massive tweet from last spring. Ladies, please do not go home with a man you met at the club. The chances of you waking up to a cat cuddling you is actually 1%. The chances of something bad happening is like 70% though. It's got a lot of likes, and part of the reaction to it was people being like, oh my god, like what is wrong with people these days? They're so anti-hookup culture and they're shitting on sexual behaviors that are supposed to be a key part of youth culture. You go to a club, you meet somebody, you're attracted to each other, you go home and you sleep together. And so like this person is an example of somebody who reacted negatively. A 70% chance. I can't stand this new brand of puritanical right-wing pick-me slut-shaming disguised as feminism. It's so gross. Now, there is something to the fact that there are maybe rad femmes, we might call them online, who do engage in very shaming behavior about a lot of sexual things or can have regressive views and package it as feminism. I like to call it the pink pill on TikTok, especially when we get into conversations about divine feminine energy and about either, needing the divine masculine or about men inherently being horrible people and starting to get into male species of different animals and all that type of shit. That exists, right? But these subsections of the online world, subsections can already be amplified to look like they're bigger than they actually are. These subspaces of these social media spaces shouldn't be taken as reflections of entire generations. But I think what happens is that also when we see those things and we see young people perpetuate them, we see young people spit reactionary things out of their mouths. And then we see tweets like this, which may not really be that bad, right? Like, hey, don't sleep with a guy you met at the club. Isn't like terrible advice, okay, right? Some people are pointing out fairly, like, I get the perspective. I don't think this is anything more than just a slightly poorly phrased, be very careful who you go home with. But when you see that and then you see the other examples of Gen Zers behaving like this, you're just like, there's something wrong with these kids. There's something so wrong with these kids. And it's like, maybe you're just seeing a variety of reactions from young women especially, which it's very funny to be like, I'm going to call young women Puritans, ostensibly to refer to the Puritans as the people who killed the witches and had, vicious, patriarchal, strict sexual politics. But actually the young women are like that because some of them have reactionary views about sex, or some of them have takes about sexual behavior that I don't like. And we also know, as Maria just points out, the algorithms of social media also like to amplify reactionary takes. We all know this, don't we? But again, there are points of data that we can look at that could maybe substantiate this, that could maybe substantiate the idea that Gen Z is more sexually conservative. And the main one that I see talked about is that Gen Z is the least sexually active young cohort in modern recorded history. 1 in 3 young men hasn't had sex in over a year, and the data goes back decades. Crunchy Skull's point, feeling that if you didn't hook up then you weren't normal, so potentially putting yourself in a situation where you're not comfortable because it's a milestone experience. Everyone does it. Right. Sometimes we look at the lack of sexual activity as a failure to meet normalcy, where normalcy is sometimes a bad thing, right? And sometimes people are not engaging at the same time with the social pressures that originate these later reactionary behaviors. What I mean is, there are a lot of things that are normalized about things you should do when you're young. You should have sex before you turn 18, condom usage, and the importance of hooking up, and you should date 50 people or whatever, that sometimes gets spread around, as well as ideas to the contrary. You should never have sex ever, you should only have sex when you're married, etc. Like all the typical Christian shit that especially predominates in where areas like Christian conservatism seem to dominate. All of this can make it so that we ignore the conditions like those and instead just say, well, these takes are so bizarre, when they can just be reactions on either end of the spectrum to those takes. So there's a lot of discussion about this. Why is Gen Z not having sex? It's like a whole thing. They're also the most depressed and suicidal, these poor people. That might be true. This person listens to occasional podcasts that dive into focus groups. The Gen Z related ones have one thing in common that they mention as a hindrance to their dating life, and that is the pervasive nature of internet culture due to a lack of third spaces. Men and women are self-segregating, and one myth we all seem to take for granted is that there's only a Gen Z male loneliness problem. It also turns out that Gen Z also have a loneliness problem. So again, like, there are conditions here, in addition to the social pressures, that might make it so that Gen Z either has these negative reactions or don't engage. We just talked about loneliness, we just talked about social alienation, we just talked about COVID. If the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic hasn't made you feel at least a little bit nervous about going out and socializing in large spaces like a club and having intimate relations with somebody that you don't know very well, then you probably weren't thinking about COVID seriously enough. And of course that has an impact, but what also has impacts are all these other things that are happening that make people more alienated. It's not like people are just going online. There's this great video on this platform I just mentioned a bit earlier, about how the chronically online that we often make fun of are this new underclass, right? People aren't just going online because they just want to be online so bad. A lot of it is driven by the fact that social life can be very difficult, especially with how much you have to work, with how much the economy is difficult, with how hard it is to find free third spaces, and then how hard it is to feel 100% safe in those third spaces, because we know about certain people's behaviors, and we also know that COVID safety, for some of us, for the few of us that care about that kind of thing, apparently, precautions about health are not often taken very seriously. So if we talk about Gen Z not having sex, that has a lot less to do with ideology and a lot more to do with society being in that place, right, for young people. Ask Feminists actually had a response to this article in this thread, which notes that this also predates COVID-19 by at least a decade, but then that would be kind of like more about 18 to 29-year-olds, including millennials, before COVID. And a lot of feminists have a response of like, hey, maybe these folks are just more conscious about the dangers that can occur. Like, lots of people were having non-consensual and fairly unsafe sex in the past. So I wonder sometimes how much we fixate on the idea of people having less sex. Like, people are waiting until they're older, having safer sex, and declining sex that they don't want because they know they don't want it. But we're supposed to feel afraid because of that. It is kind of weird, right? It's not necessarily like it's all based in that. But it is weird to hear people be like, you should go out and have all this sex, and you should be really, really cool about sexual stuff all the time. When we also are having, we're years after Me Too, and we've been having all these conversations socially, driven by millennials oftentimes, about consent, about patriarchy, about misogyny. We're in a post-manosphere environment, for God's sakes. I'm really glad that you had that experience, Crunchy Skull. Someone else says, I have 2 teenage daughters. I'm amazed at the different opinion they have regarding sex than I did at their age. They understand the concept of grooming, right? This is a big thing that has been, surging the past couple of years. The Drake versus Kendrick beef was actually, I think, a pretty interesting side of it, where people were really talking about men being creepy, where people were really talking about grooming. We're talking about, men, manipulating women, and we're talking about pedophilia in ways that, we have often been reticent to publicly shame. And they understand and stand on boundaries and consent. They seek advice from elders. I love it. So this can have many different iterations. I'm sure that there are, right? I'm not denying that there are Gen Zers who have regressive sexual politics because they, slut shame, or they have gender essentialist ideas, perhaps, right? But sex is a very personal thing, and it's one that people are becoming quite critical of. And when you go through that process, there's always going to be a lot of people that have a rough time kind of figuring out where they stand on it. Does that make sense? Like, Some people will always quote unquote take things too far. And young people do that especially. Like young people have a lot of reactions, right? To things that when they look back as they get older, they might be like, oh, like I was a little bit wrong there. Lesbian Boyfriend says, sex positivity did not do me any favors in high school. It only taught me to over-sexualize myself and encouraged me to put myself in unsafe situations, right? I understand that there is a very dicey discourse, which we'll touch on a little bit more, about like sex positive feminism versus sex negative feminism and choice feminism versus non-choice feminism or whatever. And I understand that sometimes when people can be too like critical of sex positivity, they end up going into certain conservative talking points, like women not protecting themselves, women being, promiscuous, or sex being something inherently problematic, kink shaming, whatever. I understand that. And yet, if we're not willing to square the fact that a lot of sex positivity, quote unquote, does have negative consequences in the same way, for instance, that like body image stuff has negative consequences, in the same way that like affects peer pressure for young people, that sex positivity can often be very co-opted by capitalism. Like if we're not willing to talk about that and not willing to talk about how a lot of people have had negative experiences with sex positivity, then we can't do sex positivity right? We can't actually be balanced and fair about wanting to break sexual stigmas, because we're just ignoring the harm done along the way and allowing our ideas, through the avoidance of criticism, to become easily co-optable. A lot of us had negative experiences. I'm one of them, with like being groomed online, okay? With creepy people in chat rooms. And like, even though being a victim doesn't mean that you have correct perspectives as a result, let alone that you become a good person as a result. If we're talking about Gen Z's behaviors, shouldn't we be more empathetic in trying to understand why they might do something as innocuous as choose to sleep instead of going to the club, and how they may be influenced by the fact that they were not protected in spaces, or not protected by a culture that claimed itself to be sex positive, that saw, sexualization and all these things to be a natural good in a way? Do you have any recommendations of sex positivity criticism? I don't personally. Lady Gray just made a suggestion on Being Game, what happens when sex positivity feels like pressure. Says that is a great essay, so I'd definitely check that out. One thing that I think was a really seminal point in all of this discourse was the Sabrina Carpenter thing. You might remember that I had a take about the Sabrina Carpenter album cover. I basically criticized it as something that, because it was not, more overtly putting forth a political message, because Sabrina Carpenter doesn't really do that in her work, it plays in this ambiguity where it can benefit from both conservatives seeing this as like a gender regressive thing that they enjoy, a woman, defiling herself or whatever, while also being able to have the benefit of the doubt from a lot of left-leaning people to say, oh, obviously she's critiquing it. But if she's not obviously critiquing it, then it's hard to say that that's true. And I think also a lot of my critique is more so based off of the industrial processes through which mass media is put out, versus me thinking Sabrina Carpenter is some sort of regressive person, some sort of conservative. I think all of that talk got pretty out of hand. We focus a lot of times on just the celebrity and just the public figure, and it's important that they become subjects of criticism, but that criticism not just stop at like, this is a bad person, or this is a regressive person or a conservative person. Sabrina Carpenter seems like she's chill, I guess, right? I don't know her personally. I remember at that time, this article came out on Substack by someone named Dr. Devin Price, but it's not the other Dr. Devin Price. It's not the guy who wrote Laziness is Not Real and the autism book. It is this Dr. Devin Price, who is also a social psychologist. So try to get your head around that confusion. It's called The Gen Z Millennial Divide on Sabrina Carpenter. She starts it by talking about her experience talking to millennials in their early 30s about this cover, the cover for Man's Best Friend, and that the general consensus was that those clutching their pearls over the image, presumably mostly Gen Z, were being prudish and overly sensitive about a grown woman's embodied sexuality. She notes how this image feels tame compared to like the sexualization of the underage Britney Spears at the start of her career. Britney was just one of many underage or barely legal teen pop stars that inundated millennials' airwaves as we came of age in the 90s and early 2000s. Marketed as the epitome of desirability, they were presented as the ideal we should aspire to emulate as teenagers teenagers ourselves, and boy did many of us sure try. Today, many of us look back on these images and lyrics with discomfort, and sometimes a laugh because what were we doing, at the disturbing implications in the role they had in shaping our relationship to sex and sexuality as we came of age. It's interesting she brings this up because this is kind of part of the thing that people are talking about the negativity they experience from sex positivity. And her take is essentially that when seeing Sabrina Carpenter, who is a grown woman who's 26 and seems in relative control of her image, that feels kind of more liberating because it's like, wow, compare this to what we had growing up, and it feels like a lot more autonomous and a lot more comfortable of a way for us to be sexually positive, or for us to be sex positive or whatever. But then she points out her observation talking to Gen Z. She says, in my opinion, many millennials misinterpret Gen Z's reaction to Carpenter's album cover, assuming it stems from prudishness or sexual conservatism. On the surface, this seems plausible. We know that Gen Z is having less sex and less romantic relationships than previous generations by a double-digit margin. They also seem to be particularly sensitive to sexual relationships, hyperfixating on age gaps in relationships between two consenting adults, and hand-wringing over gratuitous sex scenes in TV and film. I want to take a quick second to do a departure about these things. So age gaps is a perfect example of this discourse, right? There is a lot of reason for people to be critical of age gaps, not just ones between an adult and a child, which are not consenting relationships and therefore constitute pedophilia. But even the idea of a 35-year-old man picking up a 19-year-old girl who goes to college and dating her, there's real reason to say that that behavior is creepy. There's real reason to question why those people would potentially have a relationship when they're in such vastly different stages of their lives and have such little things to relate about, we would think. For a lot of people, it's not even about denying that the consent is there. It's about observing the real social reality behind that. And the same goes for people of the opposite gender, right? It is kind of weird to be 40 years old as a woman and to be dating somebody who's 20. And that's not necessarily to say you're doing something evil, but in a lot of cases you might be, because you might be using your position of power, whether you know it or not, and your own sort of social position to, basically date a man who is not nearly in the same place in life as you are, and to be able to then manipulate him in a lot of ways, right? It gives you a lot of space in a relationship to be kind of manipulative when you are in such a position of disproportionate power. The Leonardo DiCaprio thing is a perfect example. If we can say that what Leonardo DiCaprio does is creepy, then we can have an honest conversation about age gaps, right? Does it exist that sometimes young people, Gen Zers in particular, can be a little bit over the top about scrutinizing age gaps? Maybe, yeah. I've experienced it a little bit before. I've seen it. Oh my gosh, you're 18, she's 17. What are you, a creep? It's like, okay, obviously that's a different thing, right? But the worst thing that happens to somebody in that situation, by all the accounts that we have, the worst thing that will happen is that a few young people will make fun of you for an age gap that isn't a big deal, versus the alternative where if we're not scrutinizing age gaps enough, we have all these young women who end up in these really horrible pressured situations, dating older men that later on they realize they suffer a lot of trauma from. Condra says, it all sounds like Gen Z is thinking too much and are too critical. They should be carefree and pretend not to understand like me. I understand that it sounds like that, but I also do understand why you want to be cautious about like drawing lines between, what is acceptable to scrutinize as an age gap and what isn't, and to express concern about sometimes people being overly hypervigilant about these things, right? And as Chinyere says, Gen Z might be more aware about sex than millennials are. As Genesis Revelation says in the chat, there are power imbalances in relationships even if they don't have an age gap, and that's just a part of it. Exactly. It's part of a wider conversation, right? Boss versus employee that people are having about relationships. And sometimes it gets taken in this lens of like, oh, this is all so puritanical, when you're only seeing certain extremes of that discourse and ignoring all the positive implications it might have. And a similar thing can happen with gratuitous sex scenes in TV and film. It is widely known that a lot of women experience severe coercion in the film and TV industries. It is widely known that a lot of women look back on the sexualization they've had to participate in and they feel really upset about it. And it is widely known that, sex sells. And so sometimes movies are marketed just by the fact that they have a scantily clad woman in them that men watch to be horny, which is not on its surface like evil, but with the way these industries operate and with the society we live in, it's clear there's a lot of exploitation and social misogyny that can come from that. And so, when I look back on Game of Thrones, it's like I never felt comfortable watching that show, even though everybody was praising it. Because I was like, man, the sex stuff that I keep seeing come up in this show, it just kind of feels like it's just there to titillate people, and oftentimes ignores like some of the damaging shit that's happening in those sexual relations, as if almost like, oh, isn't this so salacious, we could be like Europe, where it's like super normal for like old French men to prey on young women, or like old French women to prey on young women. You get extremes when you try to work out these things. Which where, man, I was sex trafficked at 16, and I think we should be a little cautious. I think adults unwilling to confront their bias in sexualizing children casually because it primes kids to be exploited. Yeah, I mean, it does. Like, we should be critical about what we do so that we can change the society for the better. Anyway, I want to continue with this article because she goes on to talk about the Gen Z reaction to Sabrina Carpenter, which it wasn't all Gen Z, right? A lot of Gen Zers sided with what's seen as the millennial argument, and some vice versa, right? What millennials see as playful female empowerment, younger generations often interpret as an unwitting invitation for their male peers to treat women as objects. The question many millennials are left asking is, why? Some have proposed over-the-top outrage to the album cover as a result of declining media literacy. That may be a factor. I find that the whole media literacy argument has just become really annoying. Oh, these people just don't know media, right? You can't tell that this was satire? I mean, maybe I don't like the satire, bro. You know what I mean? Like, or maybe I just have a different opinion than you do. And maybe that doesn't mean I have media literacy. Maybe we have different perspectives. But she also notes, like, there are three major factors that have shaped Gen Z's experience: the loss of abortion rights, pandemic-induced isolation, and the growing influence of the manosphere. She talks about how she was fortunate to experience her most vulnerable years with full abortion access, and that shaped her relationship with her body and how men treated that relationship. This made the stakes for a casual fling lower if you knew you still had full control over what happened to your body if an accident happened. This access to lower stakes casual sex meant that many millennial women grew up being able to experiment and play with their sexuality in a way previous generations were not able to unless they were a part of a specific counterculture, i.e. the free love hippies of the 60s. My lack of appreciation for how the existence of Roe versus Wade shaped my experience growing up changed when a 23-year-old at a dinner party described today's sexual landscape as far more risky and oftentimes frightening compared to my generation's experience. She described a level of entitlement men had towards women's bodies that made my generation's experiences seem almost mild by comparison. This isn't to say millennial women didn't have our fair share of troubling behavior from men, but what she described felt more extreme than my own experiences. The men she encountered now treated sex and relationships in a hyper-transactional way, a bit of a shift from what I'd grown up with. Back then it was common for men to pay for dates, and some might grumble if that monetary investment did not lead to access to our bodies. But the expectation hadn't yet hardened into an outright demand for sex in exchange for footing the bill. She explained that there seemed to be a cultural shift driven by men feeling emboldened by the knowledge that women in many US states no longer have fundamental bodily autonomy. Also, many Gen Zers experienced their sexual awakenings during peak isolation of COVID-19, which we talked about, right? So there's a lot of stuff here that we could talk about in terms of social factors. The social factors are obviously very important, and also people's experiences differ, because maybe some Gen Z women don't have that same experience. A lot of them will, though, and you can't ignore the conditions that might lead to them feeling like we gotta be scrutinizing sex a lot more, especially when a lot of those, scrutinies are really important. This also goes in so many directions because, like, one of the reasons that has been attributed to Gen Z not having as much sex is that they're sleeping more. It was a survey online of 2,000 Gen Z adults that found 67% would pick a solid night of sleep over sex. And it's like, there's multiple things going on there. I know you want to roll your eyes and mutter kids these days, but they have their reasons. The survey suggests Gen Z is deliberate about intimacy, with majority saying they discuss limits before sex and feel confident saying no. So in a lot of cases, it's people being like, you know what, I have boundaries. And it's also a case of people being like, I care about my health. God forbid we take a little nap. Exactly. Especially in an environment where the economy has gotten this bad. And when everybody's so exhausted by social media usage, by state of culture, state of politics, state of the news, whatever. Yeah, maybe people might be like, you know what, hooking up with a guy or taking a nap. I think I take the nap. And that's very reasonable. But I think a lot of the issue starts to take a bit of an ugly face when we get into terms like these. Puritan. Some people mentioned this earlier. All of this discourse about Gen Z being puritanical feels related to the Puritan discourse. This is where it gets weird, because why are you making a portmanteau of Puritan and teenager? This is the Wikipedia article for it. It notes that this was being used on Twitter in March 2021. There's like a whole debate about the usage of it, but it's essentially about calling teenagers puritanical for having specific strong standards about sex and sex critical ideas and imposing those on other people. Following from the same discourse. But it's like, sometimes when we talk about this, guys, it kind of sounds like we want to fuck the kids. Do you understand? Like, it kind of sounds like, this is El País. Like, this is a very conservative paper from Spain, as far as I know. It's a conservative paper. And they always have opinion pieces like these. To be young and scandalized. Who are these Puritans anyway? They don't like their idols smoking or dating older people. They hate alcohol and drugs and find it hard to see sex as anything but evil. They are prudish teenagers on a mission to save the world's morality. And it's like, multiple things are happening here. For one, how do you think that this is all younger people? Like, all younger people are like this, based off of you coming across tweets that bother you. And two, like, some of this stuff, it really doesn't need to bother you. They debate on Twitter whether or not being gay is normal. What? Now we're talking about homophobia. Why is the issue? What? On TikTok, they expressed their hatred of Vladimir Nabokov's Lolita, but also with the same intensity of musician Matt Healy, as well as of Jenna Ortega, because one day she was seen smoking. This aged interestingly. If you know, you know. They belong to the generation that has been the most exposed to unlimited free pornography in history, and yet, or perhaps because of this, cancel porn seems to be one of their favorite hashtags. Their standards are inflexible. It feels, first of all, like a citation, I made it up, right? I just saw a bunch of different opinions shared by people that are Gen Z, and they made me feel bad, and it made me feel like they were being puritanical and judgy of me. So now they're one person, and they're all the people. They're a huge, big group of people. And it's like, even as you express this with this, this sentence, even though they have all this access to free porn, but then they want to cancel porn. It's like, so don't you think there might be a correlation there? Dating older people shouldn't be questioned? Right. I mean, with the battle cry of gross is weak. It's really bad writing, right? But moreover, it's like, you don't think that it's just a normal social phenomenon for when something becomes really ubiquitous. A youth movement might occur, or some type of backlash movement might occur to be critical about it. And it's just like, people feel like they can't be normal about it, I see this term Puritans like come up so much when it comes to fandom spaces, right? Joining a fandom where people start calling everyone Puritans at the drop of a hat. Their favorite slogan is don't like, don't read. The word censorship never leaves their mouths. And they have more respect and empathy for fictional characters than real people. This is about fandom stuff and like rifts that are occurring within fandoms for cartoons, for groups, where it seems like, the older, especially femme-coded people in a fandom are like real into like fanfics, real into like NSFW content. And some of that NSFW content might be seen as objectionable by younger people who are, of a different perspective and are more used to being critical of these sexual politics. And rather than, find private networks or whatever you guys want to do, or like accept criticism and grow from it, or like just accept that this is the kind of thing that occurs when there are generational differences and when there are many different opinions within a generation, you guys are like, oh, these Puritans. Serpentina says that's like exclusively where I've run into the term fandom. And it's just like, why do you have such a conniption about young people being strict about sex? I just don't understand it. I don't understand it. Now, all of this becomes, this is why I was saying this is an exhausting research experience. All this becomes kind of funny when you think about like how other polls and other studies might say completely different things than what all this opinion might tell you. Like in 2024, there was a study that Gen Z is the kinkiest generation yet. They're having less sex than generations past, but then they're having kinkier sex when they do. There's a lot of BDSM or other types of kink that are involved. There's a role of porn, the mainstreaming of kink, right? So this feels like a nuance that might be worthy of mentioning. And then you also have the fact that Gen Z, this is also from 2024, Gen Z adults identify as LGBTQ+ at much higher rates than older Americans. Nearly a third of Gen Z adults in the US identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, or queer. That's compared to 16% of millennials and 7% of baby boomers. So it's like, oh, they're puritanical. These young, bisexual, non-binary women who have critiques of age gaps. They're just like the Puritans, who in my head were a bunch of old Christian men that try to stop people from having sex outside of wedlock and were patriarchal. Isn't this exhausting, Rolando? Isn't this exhausting? How does this make sense? Why is this a useful thing to say? This is another, interesting little tidbit, right? This is from 2025. 21 concerning things about Gen Z dating culture, where they just talk to a bunch of different people in the BuzzFeed community who are Gen Z and ask them their opinions. First one, I'm part of Gen Z myself, but I also question the dating habits of people my age. There's too much ambiguity with the talking stage. Nobody's romantic anymore. They don't want a partner. They want a fuck buddy. And then somebody else says that Gen Z has really clear boundaries and open discussions. And somebody else says there's no intimacy. And somebody else says that their thoughts on dating are very healthy. Somebody else says they're basically the same as every other generation, just figuring it out. Somebody else says that there's so many open relationships. It's just like, at this point, it kind of becomes clear that like we are having vibes-based discussions. There's even like this TikTok intellectual that I really like, somebody who makes really great critiques that I'm usually showing on this stream, who has had multiple videos where she's like, Gen Z are puritanical, Gen Z are puritanical. I see this among a lot of like leftist posters online. Gen Z are so puritanical, they're regressive when it comes to sexual stuff. And when you hear her talk about it, it's like she substantiates it by saying, I talk to Gen Z people in real life. If anybody who talks to Gen Z people in real life, you will know exactly what I'm talking about. They are puritanical. And it's like, you guys are making my head hurt. This is like not useful social critique. I find it's very hard to do social critique. I do it all the time, right? The way that I conducted this social critique is that I'm not targeting a specific generation saying millennials are just hating Gen Z, right? Many of the people involved making these points are millennials or other Gen Z people. So I could maybe make that point, but why would I when I'm focusing more on a critique that pops up a lot that seems to lack substantiation and seems to be more so a vibes-based expression of frustration with younger generations because you feel a little bit alienated by them and their culture. Evelyn D says, I talked to one IRL and they were not puritanical, so where does that leave us? But I think what it is that it's very evocative. It's evocative to say, it's these people these days, right? Kids these days. It's so evocative to say, people are just like so crazy. And then you go, yeah, they are. In order to establish our own identities and to affirm our own beliefs, we often have to construct this idea that we live in this world where there's this large contingent of people that are trying to repress us. In order to construct our identity, we often, as older folks, 29, I'm an older person now, as, the kids these days, they just don't get it. It makes us feel, stronger in our beliefs. It makes us feel a little bit better. But that doesn't mean it's a rigorous observation. It doesn't mean that the stats really bear it out. All that we can look at and say is that social conditions have caused a lot of different Gen Z attitudes to come up that have to do with not having as much sex and that have to do with being critical of certain sexual attitudes and behaviors. I just find that it comes back down to this. This was a tweet I saw the other day that I'm going to quote forever. But no one wants to help the kids for real. Everyone just wants to be able to call them dumb, delinquents, and to say they can't read. They just want to be right. At the end of the day, it's so much easier to just pretend to concern troll your concern for the kids, to cover up the fact that you really just want to make fun of them because it helps you feel like you are this intellectual in a sea of regression. And I'm not saying that that's always the case, but in this case, when we look at this point of Gen Z being puritanical, even on its face, the statement it's nothing. It's like air. It's very little that makes sense about that. Even when we go to the etymology of what puritanical means, it's just like, where is the substance behind this? And I don't mean to say that it doesn't exist. It does. But is it being handled in a way that is really fair, that respects accountability, not just from the people you're critiquing, but from yourself? El Diablo says, as a millennial, I feel constantly reverse scandalized at how close-minded my Gen Z peers are. That's not just a vibe. I see it often and it frustrates me. Well, the thing is, the reason I say it's just a vibe is because you're talking about something from your lived experience. And observations from our lived experience are not useless, but they're not strong enough pieces of evidence to make claims like Gen Z is regressive. That's just what my point is. I get frustrated too when I see certain things that Gen Z people say. And then I remember that the more important thing for me to be thinking about is the condition that creates that thought. And that doesn't mean that I can't call those people out, but it means that I don't have the license to just say, well, the kids are just so puritanical. I just don't have the license to say that. I wrote this big conclusion here. If you see a hot take online that you find anti-intellectual, resist the urge to say kids these days. I think that's the biggest problem. Kids these days. In my mind, this is my opinion, kids these days is just never a good point of argument. I just never have liked kids these days. I never will. Isn't that the name of a band? I'm not talking about the band, if it exists. I like critiquing individuals. I'm a big fan of critiquing individuals. I just did it a bunch of times. But kids these days, it just feels like the kind of dismissive attitude that adults have of younger generations. Young people obviously have a wide variety of diverging opinions, and the generational observations we can substantively make are based on observable social, political, and economic changes, right? Like the ways in which social isolation has led to Gen Z having less sex, for instance. Polling about Gen Z's political opinions is not usually compelling enough to make sweeping conclusions. Afterward, the only evidence we're left with to conclude that Gen Z is puritanical / sex negative, etc., is the Gen Z people I've talked to are like this. And then at that point, we're just debating over whose lived experience is realer. Ultimately, what we can conclude about Gen Z's political views is that they are widely more anti-establishment, distrustful of institutions, and disillusioned by an isolating and exhausting social and work life. If this leads some Gen Z to come to puritanical conclusions, we can at least understand why, and focus more on confronting these systemic problems than on scolding younger people for potentially misunderstanding them. It's always kids these days and back in my day, Lydia, exactly. I love critiquing individuals as well as critiquing systems, but this ain't it. This is just not a good way to critique individuals. It's not a good way to critique a social phenomenon. Instead, maybe we should think about a critique like this. Why are certain young adults turning towards reactionary attitudes? Maybe we can narrow who we're talking about. I'm gonna be honest with you, I don't know how to do it, but there's some better way to do it than this. That's the last thing I have to say about that. Jenna Post 99 has a great comment. I feel like the definition of puritanical has shifted in a sinister way too. I think it used to have a connotation with punching down, and now it seems like it just means don't critique your elders. Yeah, puritanical, I remember people using that term to describe like governments. I don't know, churches.